with Olebogeng on OFM, the sound of your life.
It's the Business Hour on OFM, the sound of your life. I'm Olebogeng Motsi. South African businesses have until June 2021 to ensure that they fully comply with the Protection of Personal Information Act, often called the POPIA Act. With the date looming tonight, we delve into data breaches and the implications for companies with executive at ENS Africa's Dispute Resolution Department, Nicole Gabryk. Here is that conversation. Nicole, what exactly is a data breach under the Protection of Personal Information Act?
So it's quite widely defined, and I think it's relatively interesting because it's slightly different to perhaps other pieces of data protection legislation in the world. So the first thing that we need to know is any time that we have an unauthorized access or acquisition of personal information, it constitutes what they call a security compromise under Section 22 of the POPIA. So really, what we firstly don't look for is any potential harm to data subjects in considering whether or not there's been a data breach. And any time that we think somebody who shouldn't have access to that personal information may have accessed it, it then constitutes a security compromise, which is reportable, firstly to the Information Regulator's Office and secondly to the affected data subject.
What happens when a company suffers a data breach?
So the first thing to note is POPI only regulates what they call the responsible party. The responsible party is the party who is in essence in control or responsible for that personal information. So where the breach, for example, happens to a third party, which is called an operator who's doing something on your behalf, that liability will still attach to the responsible party, even if it's being done by a third party on that person's behalf. There are a number of angles of liability that flow from this act. The first thing is that the information regulator is able to levy a penalty after enforcement action has been taken for breaches of the act. So where you perhaps haven't notified the Information Regulator's Office or the data subjects of the event and the harm that could flow from that event in order to take preventative measures. If you don't cooperate with any investigation that the Information Regulator's Office may carry out, you're also liable for fines and penalties. The information officer, who by default is the CEO of the company, but it can also be delegated to somebody else, they can be criminally liable for actions and for going to jail. And then very importantly, it opens up a civil remedy in Section 99 of POPI, which is in effect a court remedy for any affected data subject who can then sue the responsible party for damages. Now, very importantly for that, the first thing it does is it encompasses an aspect of what's called strict liability, where irrespective of whether there's negligence or intent on the part of the responsible party, it can be responsible for damages. So, for example, if your employees negligently allow a data breach to occur and that causes harm to data subjects, the company can then be liable. And then secondly, it introduces a concept called aggravated damages, which a court can award, which is a form of punitive damages which is new to South African law. We've seen it in the Australian law, for example. It's one of the forms of damages that is awarded under data breaches. And really where a company has been grossly negligent or perhaps is guilty of some form of gross misconduct, it's an additional form of penalties other than normal harm that can be imposed on that company for a data breach. Because POPI forces you before a breach occurs to take certain steps to safeguard the information. If you fall short of safeguarding and that is what has led to the breach, then your failure to have taken reasonable measures to safeguard that information can be penalized under the Act as well. So really it's quite a broad form of liability from all sides of the coin.
I'm speaking to Executive at ENS Africa's Dispute Resolution Department, Nicole Gabryk, on the implications of data breaches when the POPIA Act comes into effect. In your opinion, Nicole, have cyber attacks increased in the last year?
So obviously with the COVID-19 pandemic, we've had to switch by and large to putting workforces into a remote working environment. And a lot of organizations' security, and by that I mean IT security first and foremost, wasn't prepared for the remote working environment. So there's certain fundamental steps from an IT perspective that organizations should implement to safeguard information and access to systems. But a lot of companies just weren't prepared for it, and so you took people out of the perhaps secure environments of the office networks and placed them into a home working environment. So, for example, people's Wi-Fi at home perhaps aren't secured properly, and that allows access to systems through back doors. We've also seen lax control around paper. So it's important to note that POPIA doesn't only regulate IT personal information, but any physical personal information is also regulated. So where we perhaps take paper home with us, it's perhaps kept in our homes or in our cars and it's not looked after in the same fashion, as well as cost cutting in organizations. So what we've seen obviously is organizations to respond and survive the pandemic and the situation just generally around it have had to face areas where they've needed to cut back on certain costs. And I think IT security has been a cutback for many organizations, which has allowed for an increase in cyber attacks.
Recently, Experian suffered this data breach and released a data response guide. What are some of the key points or pointers that organizations can take away from that guide?
Sure. So there's a number of key takeaways, both from the Experian breach guide, but generally. I think the pivotal steps that we need to look out for is firstly pre-breach response. That is preparing for the breach in advance of any breach. So that is looking at our IT and security systems and doing an audit of that to understand, firstly, what are our password policies? Do we have remote access that is securely gained to networks? Do we regularly check who has access to our systems that we don't have fictitious accounts being created? Preparing an incident response team and an incident response plan who is coordinated well in advance of any breach to actually respond to a breach. And that includes doing dry runs of any breach in your organization so that your key coordinated team is able to respond. Then post-breach response, there's certain things that are fundamental. The first thing is protecting your company's reputation and communication strategy, and that is also identified in the Experian Breach Response Guide quite nicely. So making sure that you are able to have a coordinated response from a PR and communications perspective. I mean, I know of an example where a company suffered a breach and the poor receptionist wasn't properly briefed, and every time a client was phoning in, she was saying to them, unfortunately, our systems are down because we've suffered a data breach. And you can see that that may have some serious ramifications from a reputational perspective for an organization where somebody innocently is communicating something. So that's the first step. The next thing is protecting your customers. So letting your customers, so doing a forensic IT analysis or doing an internal analysis of the extent of the breach, and actually informing customers in a very selective and particular way as to how they can safeguard themselves, and then actually taking steps to safeguard that information as best as possible post-breach so that your clients and customers are looked after. And then finally, taking legal advice to secure privilege is very important. We spoke a little earlier about the penalties that can be imposed and civil litigation that can happen. And so it's very important that you preserve legal privilege and you take advice to mitigate the damages and penalties that can flow.
That was my conversation with Legal Eagle at ENS Africa, Nicole Gabryk, regarding how businesses need to handle cyber breaches to avoid penalties when the POPIA Act comes into effect. She stresses that companies need to focus on pre-breach response, auditing their security systems, and adequately preparing for a possible attack. Now, to hear more of Nicole's advice, you can listen to the full interview on the business blog on ofm.co.za.
The Business Hour with Olibogeng on OFM, the sound of your life.